And so, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to move from progressivism into an era referred to as imperialism. Now, when you hear the word imperialism, you need to think about terms like empires and colonies and things like that. All right. Generally speaking, when you hear the term empire, what the vast majority of people are going to think of probably is going to be things like European places or possibly the United States as being imperial powers. But in all honesty, that would be a mistake, okay? You can look back through all of human history and you can really see that there have been, I should say, a number of different empires in a number of different places around the world. Now, probably the most famous example from history would be a European example, and that would be the Roman Empire. Now, while you do have a large number of people don't have a real deep knowledge of what the Roman Empire was about, how it worked, its history, and things like that, you do have a large number of people do have at least the knowledge that the Roman Empire existed. Okay, you can look at like Meso and South America. You can look at things like the Aztec Empire or the Inca Empire. They existed for quite a bit of time as well. You can look to Asia, to places like Imperial Japan or Imperial China. What I'm basically saying is that the idea of creating an empire is not unique to any one portion of the world. We have seen empires come and go throughout history. Generally speaking, you're going to see empires rise, they're going to exist for a while, and then they're going to fall. And why do they come into existence? Okay, now that could be for a number of different reasons. For example, it could be a military reason. It could be that you as a nation are trying to set up an empire so that others would not think about attacking you. They would look at you, and the perception is that you are far too strong to actually be attacked. Okay, or it could be on the military side. It could also simply be that you're trying to create what would be called a buffer zone. You're trying to create an area that an enemy would have to fight through in order to get to wherever you are. So, militarily speaking, those are some of the reasons that empires are formed. You could also think of it in a much more simple way. What about something like food? There have been empires in the past that have grown just so that they would have areas that were providing food back to the home country. So you think about it. We've gone through a long period of time, thousands of years of human history, in which trying to make sure that you had enough food was a major concern. I mean, granted, today we have the ability to use mechanization and industrialization so that we have more food being produced now by fewer people than ever before. But look back through the course of history at how many times famine has destroyed nations and empires and things along those lines. So it could be, something as simple as food is why you have an empire. Along those same lines, we could be talking about economics. Now, the United States really came into existence because of economics, or the economics of empire. Okay, we started out as, essentially 13 colonies of England. Now, I want you to think back to the 1600s, back when the New World had just been discovered, and you had all sorts of European powers trying very hard to get a foothold in North and South America. Now, Spain, they had a lot of advantages because they had been here longer. But you also have nations like Portugal and England, France, Holland, Sweden, all sorts of nations were trying to get a foothold. Now, our 13 colonies of England, we existed for the economic benefit of the empire, okay? Generally, what was going to happen was we were going to send raw materials back to England, okay? We had an abundance of raw materials that would then be used by England to fuel industry. It would be used to fuel the Industrial Revolution. Those raw materials would then be turned into finished goods, and those finished goods could then be sold anywhere in the world, sometimes right back to the colonies that had provided the raw materials for them. England, at its height, just before World War II, would have the greatest empire on earth. There is some statistics I've seen that say approximately 40% of the Earth's surface was owned by England at that point in time. Now, the United States never really planned to become an imperial nation. We never really thought about having colonies. We started off as those 13 states clinging to the East Coast. After the Revolution, we had pretty much the land between the Atlantic and the Mississippi River, and we started to head west. In 1803, we buy Louisiana from France. We now can go even further west because we have territory all the way up to present day Oregon and Washington. In the 1840s, we have a war with Mexico in which the present day southwest of the United States is going to be added to the nation. It's the concept of what was referred to as manifest destiny, the idea that it was the American destiny to rule our portion of the continent from sea to shining sea, which we did. So we're looking at a time frame right now of the late 1800s, early 1900s. And the United States is not a nation trying to build an empire. Most of the nations at this time are, especially European nations. Part of it has to do with pride. Part of it is trying to argue that, well, my nation is just as good as yours. So you had nations, all over the place at this point in time. You had the French Empire in North Africa and Southeast Asia. You had the German Empire had holdings throughout the world. Spain still had an empire at that point in time. And they're all doing this for, like I said, the purpose of pride. They're doing it to expand markets. They're doing it for natural resources, all the things that we've mentioned before. The United States is not on that bandwagon. We're not trying to build an empire, but we kind of have it dropped in our lap. In 1898, we go to war with Spain. When all is said and done, we have a number of different possessions around the world, not the least of which would be places like the Philippines and Cuba and Puerto Rico. And as a result, we now have to figure out what we're going to do. The United States had never planned to be a colonial power. We had never planned on having colonies or anything along those lines. But now we have all these different parts of the world that are now our responsibility. And as such, we have to go through and we have to figure out what exactly it is that we are going to do as a nation, as a people, with this newfound responsibility. Are these going to become new states? Are we going to just administer them? Are we going to give them freedom? We have to figure out what is our new position. It's not one that we'd ever planned on, but it's one that we now had to figure out. So what was going on in the world at this time? What was it that actually was going to cause America to expand? What was it that was going to cause America to really start looking not just beyond its own borders, but over the horizon, looking at different areas of the world that not necessarily had been on our radar at the time, but now were becoming much more important? A big portion of that was going to be global competition. Now, you and I live in a world today in which we don't think much about where we buy things. It can be imported from anywhere in the world, and we have American products that are sold anywhere in the world. This was not always the case. Oftentimes, it was much more insular. It was much more you as a nation produced your own goods and things along those lines, and there wasn't necessarily a lot of trade in between nations. There would always be trade, but nothing like what it is today. So in the 1800s, late 1800s, you're starting to see more and more nations start to compete with one another, not just for things such as the raw materials necessary to keep industry going, but also looking for places where they could actually sell those goods. Think about it. If you have an industrial society and they're producing, whatever, you have to have some place to sell those. Otherwise, if you're producing whatever that good is, then eventually you're going to reach a point where there's nobody left really at home to purchase that. When there's nobody left to purchase whatever the product is, that means that you're going to have to start laying people off. That's going to end up messing up your economy, and that's going to cause all sorts of problems. So we're at a point in time in the 1800s where nations are really starting to look for other places that they can compete. In fact, by the 1880s, you had a number of American leaders began to think that the U.S. should establish some kind of colonies overseas. Now, this didn't necessarily mean have colonies and have an empire in the traditional sense. There were those who did want that. There were those individuals in the United States who felt that we should be an imperial power just like anyone else in the world, that we should go around the planet, we should be able to establish our own colonies and grow that way. There were others who wanted to look at something different. There were those who thought that we should just try to deal more along the lines of economic colonies, that we should be doing more trade with different people and stuff like that. But the idea was that there were those within the United States who felt that we needed to really jump on the bandwagon, as it were. We needed to become an imperial power. Now, imperialism in and of itself, we said that really you need to think about things like empires and colonies and things along those lines. Well, the basic definition of imperialism is this. Okay, imperialism is the policy in which stronger nations extend economic, political, or military control over weaker territories. Generally speaking, oftentimes this means that the stronger nation has gone out and conquered that weaker territory through either just straight up military action of some kind, or they have gone through and they have been able to negotiate with whoever the ruling powers were at that, in that particular area, and they have created the ability really to go through and expand where their influence is. Now, you can also throw into this the concept that it's just the idea of the influence that they have over other nations. A lot of times in imperialism, what we're talking about is one country basically running the affairs of another country. They are a colony, but they serve the greater good, as it were. They serve the home country. So when you think about imperialism, like we said before, it could be economic, political, military, all of the above, but that is the controlling aspect of one country over another country. And empires have a tendency to go up against one another. It is entirely possible that you will see various empires going to war, and that really did happen at this point in time. Now, European countries had competed for territory all over the world, and we mentioned this. You could go back to the 1600s when the European powers were trying to get a foothold in North and South America. Well, nothing had really changed. The various European powers had continued trying to grow their influence, trying to grow their empires all over the world. Like I said, Britain, for example, they would be able to control somewhere in the range of 40% of the earth when they were at their height. France, they would have colonies in North Africa. They would also have famously colonies in Indochina. This would be places like Vietnam and Cambodia. And that would hold on right through the 1950s when France was fighting their Vietnam War. Spain, as I mentioned before, Spain had once had a massive empire. It was no longer at its height, but Spain did still retain a number of possessions all over the world. And the same would be true for Germany and Italy and pretty much all the European powers. Now, they had gone through and they had gotten control of the various areas that they were in charge of through a variety of means, as we said. And sometimes they got along well with each other. Sometimes the nations did have some conflict. They did not exactly go through all-out war, but there would be what would be referred to as border skirmishes. You would essentially have fighting might happen out somewhere in the world between colonial powers, but it wouldn't necessarily be a full-blown war between the two European powers. But they had been in competition for the longest period of time. They had gone through, and most of the European powers had grabbed as much as they possibly could. Sometimes it went well, sometimes it went poorly. But the idea was that they all wanted to have the strongest empire possible. Now, America had watched all of this happening. Okay, we saw these various European powers controlling various portions of the globe, and a lot of Americans began to accept the idea of overseas expansion. Now, again, there were those who thought we should be exactly like Britain or Europe, that we should go through, we should have colonies, we should have an empire, etc., that we could do anything the other nations did. Others looked at expansion in a different way. Others looked at it that, yes, we did need to expand. We did need more access to raw materials. We did need more access to markets to purchase our goods and things like that. And so there were those who wanted to look at this in a more economic sense. They didn't want to have that control over all these various colonies, but they did want the ability to go through and have access to those natural resources. So as time went on, as the various European powers began to solidify where they were going to actually, hold sway, where they were going to be able to be in charge essentially, more and more Americans began to think, all right, we need to look at this differently. We need to figure out what is our place on the global stage. We definitely need to expand, but the question was then becoming, how do we expand? What do we do? How exactly do we make our presence known on the global stage? Now, keep in mind, I commented previously that one of the main reasons that an empire is formed is that concept of military strength. It is the desire to go through and either make sure that your nation is perceived as too strong to be attacked, or to make your nation actually too strong to be attacked, or what's more, at least try to set up what's referred to as a buffer zone, an area in which an enemy would have to fight their way through just to get to where you are. And there were a number of different powers that were going through and building up their militaries at this time. Now, the thing is that no one quite realized we were getting ready to head into the Great War, World War One, and all of this buildup in the military was going to actually come back to be more of a problem than a blessing, but still in all, nobody knew it at that time. So we're looking at America's desire for more military strength, ladies and gentlemen. Now you have to keep in mind, you had the European powers were investing heavily in their militaries, as was Imperial Japan. So while we didn't quite grasp the fact that we would be fighting against Germany and Japan in World War II, let alone just seeing the short term that we would have World War I coming up, we did see that other nations were becoming stronger. And there is always that desire to make sure that your nation is sufficiently protected that others are not going to attack you. Now, with Britain, for example, you had the Royal Navy. Britain had the most powerful fleet on the face of the earth. And really, that was kind of a necessity. You think about it. Britain had an empire covering some 40% of the globe. They needed the ability to go through and actually manage that empire. Germany, for example, they had the largest land army in Europe at that time. They had somewhere in the range of 5 million men under arms. Plus, they were starting to look into building up their navy. Japan was doing the same thing. They were building up their navy and military. So you have a great number of powers around the world are going through, and they are working very hard on building up their military to a point that the United States has taken notice. And we've also noticed that we're not doing so well. Our military has sort of fallen by the wayside. Some of the ships we had in our Navy at this point in time actually dated back to the Civil War. So as a result, while we had gone through and we had built up quite a bit during the Civil War, in the 30 years or so after that, things had really dropped off. A military is how you can project power around the globe. And the United States was in the unenviable position that we really didn't have the ability to project any kind of power whatsoever. To this very day, the U.S. Navy can send an aircraft carrier group anywhere in the world, and that projects power. At this point in time, we really didn't have much along those lines. And so you have a gentleman by the name of Alfred T. Mann. Now, he was going to be he was originally a captain of some various vessels during the Civil War, so he was a naval officer. His father was actually an army officer, believe it or not, but he was going to be a naval officer. He was going to be put in charge of what was at this point in time something new. It was called the Naval War College in Rhode Island. This is still in existence today. It is a finishing school. It is where you get some very, very high training for naval officers. Well, Alfred Mann here came up with the idea that we had a necessity that was lacking in the United States. That was our naval power. Okay. Today we use, there's an old phrase called the sea lanes of communication, and we lacked the ability to have any kind of control on that. So what he was looking at was the future decisive battle that he thought was coming. That what we needed to do was we needed to go through and rebuild our navy in such a way that they would be able to amass a good deal of firepower, that they would be able to go through and punch a hole in an enemy fleet, therefore leaving wherever we were attacking open to an invasion of some kind. And he was lucky in the sense that you had the Secretary of Navy at the time, a guy by the name of Benjamin Tracy, agreed with him on this. So you had man going through and putting forth his ideas on naval power, how we needed to build up the U.S. Navy so that we were a match for anyone on the planet. And in 1890, you had the Navy Bill of 1890 passed. Historians are not good at naming things. It goes through and it's going to start to modernize the American fleet. We're going to have some battleships built, brand new state-of-the-art battleships. Ships, for example, like the USS Maine and the USS Oregon. There would be others coming along as well, but these were two of the state-of-the-art, top-notch, world-class battleships. We are going to change the way the Navy looks and operates. Now, keep in mind, today, the biggest, most powerful ship we have in the Navy is the aircraft carrier. Well, this is a time long before we had that. Once upon a time, the way you projected power with your Navy was to go through and have battleships. And we're talking about ships with 15, 16-inch guns. Essentially, you can think about the shell being fired has a diameter of 15 inches. And that's going to launch that 2,000-pound shell upwards of 10 to 15 miles. So this is the way that you're going to express the power that your nation has. And believe it or not, it was Andrew Carnegie's Bessemer process that really allowed us to do this. Now, Carnegie, he was not a big fan of working with the Navy. He was really more of a pacifist, to be honest. And so he sort of, held off, not wanting to go through and actually be a part of this at the outset. But eventually he did come about to help out. He even built an entire plant just to produce the steel necessary for the warships. So you think about it, this is a major change. This is how we're going through, and we're using the technology that's been developed over the past several years to modernize our fleet and to put us on the world stage. In fact, it worked out so well, this combination of Mann, Tracy, and Teddy Roosevelt, he was president at the time, that we went from being the world's 13th most powerful Navy. Out of the entire world, we were number 13, lucky number 13. And we changed that. We went from being 13th to number 3. Number 1 was going to be the Royal Navy, but we were not that far behind. The thing is, we didn't know with whom we might have to fight. We were in no way, shape, or form ready or able to fight the Royal Navy. But the good news was we didn't have to. There was no tension rising between ourselves and Great Britain. We are going to see coming up in the not too far future that we are going to have to be fighting against Spain. And while a lot of the European powers assumed that that was going to be an easily won victory by the Spanish, it turned out to be somewhat different. And we will be talking about that in a little bit. You also have to keep in mind one of the other aspects of imperialism I talked about was the need for economic expansion. Now, the United States at this time, we weren't just looking at expanding our military power, we also had the benefit and problem of our industry. We needed new markets. Now, the United States, for a long period of time, had been a predominantly agricultural nation. Now, we've talked about this before. We've talked about the vast majority of people in the United States lived in small towns or on farms, and that had pretty much held true right through the Civil War. Well, following the Civil War, you started to see that urbanization. You started to see people moving to the cities because that's where the jobs were. We saw how technology and mechanization had made it so much easier to produce more with fewer people. And that could be products, it could be food, it didn't really matter. We were using technology to produce more. Now, on the one hand, that is fantastic. By the late 1800s, we had made such technological advances and changes in the United States that every aspect of our production was now different. Farms were growing food at phenomenal rates. Factories were producing goods faster than they ever had before. People were able to turn out more goods than had ever been seen in the United States. And on the one hand, that is fantastic. It means that things are getting cheaper. It means that we're able to go through and we're able to actually have all these various products available at, not exactly a moment's notice, but something close to that. So that's great. We have food, we have products, people are working. But there is a downside to that. We were now producing more than we could actually consume. We were producing more food than was needed by the people of the United States. Now, on the one hand, that is a fantastically good thing. You think about it. Famine had long been an issue for humanity. Well, it seems to be kind of fading into the background at this point. So that's a plus. We have more than enough food. But it also means that the unsold food is going to rot. And that can screw up the life of the people who are growing various, crops. You think about it. Let's say that there are a whole bunch of people growing the same thing, wheat, for example. Well, the issue is going to be whether or not the price gets driven down so far that it's not worth your time and effort to actually grow that. And therefore, you might be in a great deal of trouble because you're not able to make the money necessary to keep going. Same thing could be said in regards to factories. Okay, you build whatever your little widget is. You build whatever your little doodad, and people buy that. Well, eventually, everybody has one. So what do you do at that point? Do you keep building the same thing that you've already, saturated the market? Do you find something new? What do you do? Both of these are problems of having excess. Both of these mean that we had done so well that we are now becoming our own enemy. So what do you do about that? We needed foreign trade. We needed to be able to find new markets that would buy our goods, that would buy our crops. We needed to go around the world and find new places that wanted to buy our things. Now, this is still an issue and a question today. We have a global economy today. This is in the early stages, really. But the global economy today is you can buy things on Amazon right now that may come from China, the United States, Canada, Europe. It doesn't matter. It comes from all over the place. Well, that's what we were looking for. We were trying to figure out a way to sell our goods and our crops overseas to other markets, markets that needed what we were producing, so we had to figure out a way in which case to do that. We needed those markets to buy our stuff and to get the raw materials for our factories. Remember, we spoke about when the United States, when we were colonies of Great Britain, that essentially our job was to go through and was to provide all these different resources to Britain so that they could produce various goods and then sell those all over the world. Well, now we were the producer. We were the ones who needed those raw materials coming into the United States to be able to produce various goods that we could then sell all over the planet. We had gone from being the colony providing the raw materials to being the producer needing the raw materials. And it's still that way today. You can still look at a variety of different items that the United States needs to make different products, and you have to get those from areas around the world. Sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's more difficult. And it was no different back in the late 1800s than it is now. You had to be able to get what you needed to make your particular product. Now, the book uses the phrase belief in cultural superiority. There was an aspect of that dealing with the feeling of being superior over different groups of people. There was a poem written by Rudyard Kipling back around this time called The White Man's Burden, which talked about the necessity of nations like the United States and Britain to go through and civilize the rest of the world. And so there was some aspect of that. But really, what we're talking about here, it's that the belief being the United States, that the people here in the U.S. were better than the people of other countries, okay? The idea being that we had so much here that the way we ran our lives, the way we lived our lives, the way we set up our government, the way we did A, B, C, D, E, education, you name it, all of the above, the way we did things produced the best results. And as a result, the United States wanted to go through and wanted to literally export that ability to other countries. We wanted to go through and be able to share with other nations around the world how we did things so that they could copy them and have the exact same result. Now, like I said, there was in some aspects, there was a bit of, sort of a racist feel to that, but generally speaking, it was more along the lines of the United States saw themselves as having been successful because of fill in the blank, and they wanted to expand that. They wanted to share that same feeling with other people around the world. People in the United States sometimes felt they had a duty, they had a responsibility to spread their culture and religion to all corners of the globe. And there are still, a lot of aspects that the United States does try to export around the world. It's the concepts of like democracy and a republic and things like that. It's the idea, again, that what we have in the United States is a result of the way we have done things in the United States. And therefore, we can benefit other nations by helping them with that. Excuse me. You can see some of this in regards to dealing with Afghanistan and Iraq in the wars we've been fighting, that has transitioned into what they refer to as nation building. It is the idea that we are there to try and help improve the lot of life of the people that we're dealing with, and there was no real difference here at this time. The American people, especially at this point in time, saw themselves as having really succeeded at a great number of things, and they wanted to share that success with other people all over the world. They thought the best way to do that was to help spread culture and the various ideas of the United States.